Indian Territory, September 13, 1864. Confederate Brigadier Generals Richard Montgomery Ganot and Stan Watie meet at Camp Pike in the Choctaw Nation to discuss Watie's planned raid north of the Arkansas River. The two leaders have combined their forces in what is hoped will be a lightning strike into the northern part of the Indian nations now under Union control. Spies have informed the Southern leaders of a large Union wagon supply train, which will soon leave Fort Scott, Kansas, en route to Fort Gibson, Indian Territory. Situated between the two forts is the halfway point known as the Cabin Creek Station. Federal forces have built a stockade and stationed 170 soldiers of the 2nd Indian Home Guard Regiment to protect the crossing of the Texas Road at Cabin Creek. The mere mention of Cabin Creek must have brought bitter memories to Watie. On July 1st and 2nd, 1863, Watie's command of 2,000 men had been routed by a Union force made up of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, the 6th Kansas Cavalry, and the Indian Home Guards. The Federal force had placed artillery at strategic points on a ridge overlooking the Cabin Creek Ford, which ripped the Southern lines on the opposite bank to shreds. The fighting was brutal. Watie later called the First Battle of Cabin Creek the most severest fight of any fought in the country. It is indeed ironic that on the bluffs of Cabin Creek, where Stan Watie was once handed his worst defeat, he would return to the same battleground to gain his most brilliant victory in what has been called one of the most daring raids of the American Civil War. This is Cabin Creek, located near the small town of Pensacola in what is now northeastern Oklahoma. From all appearances, there's nothing unusual about this large creek which empties into the Grand or Neosho River 3 miles distant. Like similar waterways, it is a haven for wildlife. For years, local residents passed down folklore about the battles here at Cabin Creek. Battles fought with musket, pistol, saber, and cannon. Engagements fought during the bloody conflict known today by many names. In the South, the period was, and sometimes is still referred to as the War for Southern Independence. In the North, it was known as the War of the Rebellion. But the name that most historians give to the struggle is the Civil War. And as with most Civil War battles and skirmishes fought in Indian Territory, the battles at Cabin Creek are almost forgotten, except for a few historians' notes and papers. The soldiers who fought and died here were black, Indian, and white. Regiments from Kansas and Colorado, as well as Wisconsin and Texas, saw action along the Cabin Creek bluffs. And many of those who died lie buried here in unmarked and totally forgotten graves. Such was the honor often bestowed upon many Civil War soldiers. When one stands on the banks of Cabin Creek today, it seems as though you've stepped back in time. Except for the occasional sound of an airplane passing overhead, the 20th century has bypassed this corner of Oklahoma. The surrounding countryside has changed little since the mid-1860s, when the Civil War was at its bloody peak. Today, the only difference in the creek's appearance is that it holds the backwater for Lake Hudson, which makes it wider and deeper than it was during the Civil War. The area around the crossing of the Texas Road at Cabin Creek is probably one of the most historic sites in the state and perhaps even in the nation because of a natural highway. 10,000 years ago, the Osage Indians followed a buffalo trail which forded the creek. As time passed, word spread about the Osage Trace, and the white man eventually used the trail dubbed the Immigrant Road to Texas. And so, the Texas Road became the main highway for thousands of settlers headed west. During the Civil War, the road was also used as a supply line between Fort Scott and Fort Gibson, thus acquiring the name of the Military Road or the Texas Military Road. Many of the famous and infamous crossed the Cabin Creek Ford as they rode down the Texas Road to their appointments with destiny. Among the many historical figures were Washington Irving, noted author and scholar, Sam Houston, pioneer and later President of the Republic of Texas, Zachary Taylor, Major General in the United States Army and later President of the United States, Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War and later President of the Confederate States of America, and Jesse James, first a lieutenant in William C. Quantrill's band of ruthless raiders, and then a fabled outlaw in his own right. Besides the explorers, military men, and outlaws, there was also a bold breed of pioneer men and women who traveled down the Texas Road to what they hoped would be a new and better life. Some came freely, others came by force. Joseph Lynch Martin was one of those brave pioneers. A Cherokee Indian by birth, he and his family had come to Indian Territory from Georgia over the Trail of Tears. Martin's father, John, had been the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Cherokee Nation. Joe Martin himself was well known within the Cherokee tribe and other tribal circles. Among the wealthiest landowners at the time, he owned the largest ranch in Indian Territory of well over 100,000 acres.
The Pensacola Ranch ran from what is now Ketchum, Oklahoma, down to what is now Salina, Oklahoma, all on the west side of Grand River. About 100,000 acres spread. In those days, this land belonged to the Cherokee tribe, and anyone of Cherokee blood could rent land from the tribe. And they rented it for half a cent to a cent an acre. They could own the site where their improvements were, or at least they had a right to claim it. No one could take it away from them. But they had to pay a little rental to the tribe for the use of the land. And that's the way they operated in those days.
Martin built two large houses on his ranch. The first one, called Greenbrier, stood on the site of this church near Strang, Oklahoma. He built the other house just south of the Cabin Creek Ford on the Texas Road. He named this place Pensacola, which in Cherokee means land of beautiful flowers. The town of Pensacola is named for the old Martin Ranch. Both houses were furnished with the very latest fashions and furniture from St. Louis and New Orleans. Because of his house at Greenbrier, Martin was affectionately known as Greenbrier Joe for the rest of his life. Martin was also a slaveholder, owning more than 100 slaves working on his vast ranch. This gentleman is Tobe Martin. He was the son of William, the slave who rose to be overseer or foreman of Joe Martin's Pensacola ranch. Tobe was one of slave William's sons who was born into freedom. He died in 1972 at the ripe old age of 104. One interesting story about the Martin household has been passed down over the years. Instead of using slaves as house servants, he hired 14 full-blood Cherokees as servants. He did this because he wanted his children to learn Cherokee as a second language to English. The plan backfired, however, when the children taught the Cherokee servants how to speak English. The Cabin Creek Ford was an overnight stop for settlers traveling through by wagon train. Greenbrier Joe later recalled counting over 1,000 wagons passed by his house during a 6-week period. Besides the Martin residence, ranch buildings, and slave quarters, there was also a small community which sprang up at Cabin Creek. This included a stage station, a blacksmith shop, a few other private residences, and a trading post run by a full-blood Cherokee named Tom Knight. A natural spring still runs near the old Texas Road. No doubt this spring was one of the drinking sources for the Martin household, for overnight campers, and for a base built by the Union Army sometime in the fall of 1863 after the first battle of Cabin Creek. According to numerous eyewitnesses and historical accounts, the stockade stood 12 feet high, had enclosed quarters for officers and enlisted men, and also had a hospital. However, the war would change everything for the little community at Cabin Creek. No traces of the dwellings or the stockade remain. Now the only man-made items found here are the occasional trash left by visitors, and this monument, erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1959. It commemorates the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, fought September 19th, 1864. At the outbreak of the war in 1861, Greenbrier Joe became Captain Joe Martin of Company D in Stan Waty's 2nd Cherokee Mounted Volunteers, Confederate States Army. Martin's oldest son, Alexander, and his teenage son, Richard, also joined the Confederate Army for the duration. As other Confederate Indian volunteers had done, he sent the rest of his family south, out of harm's way, to northern Texas. Martin told his slaves to watch over the ranch and both houses, and that for the time being, they were on their own.
The year was 1864, thousands died to fight no more in that awful struggle called the Civil War. In the East, Atlanta fell, Petersburg a living hell, out west the rebels left to fight alone.
Late summer 1864. The war between the United States and the Confederate States of America has waged for almost 3.5 bloody years. Young men who started the war with the thrill of adventure and the thirst for honor and glory instead sleep forever in peaceful pastures and farmlands, now turned into cemeteries. Only battle-hardened veterans have survived. Men who now know the realities of a nation torn by war. No honor, no glory, no marching bands. It seems misery and death are everywhere. Unlike any war the young nation has known, this is a personal war of neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. The curtain is about to rise on 3 decisive scenes in this life or death drama. After weeks of fighting, Atlanta falls to Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army. On September 2nd, 1864, Federal forces occupy the city. The capture of Atlanta marks a change in Northern war policy to one of total war. In less than 2 months, Sherman's army will start on its famous March to the Sea. Sherman tells President Abraham Lincoln and his commander, Ulysses Simpson Grant, that he will make Georgia howl. Major General Philip Sheridan's Army of the Shenandoah is setting the torch to the Shenandoah Valley, known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Without foodstuffs from the valley, it is believed Lee's army will starve. Sheridan brags that when he is through, a crow flying over the valley will have to carry 3 days' rations. His statement turns out to be a prophetic one, as his men burn and destroy all crops, barns, and houses in the valley, not giving any heed to the allegiance of its owners. Anything that can be used by the Confederate Army is destroyed. General Ulysses S. Grant renews attacks on Lee's lines south and north of the James River. Union forces advance another 2 miles southwest of Petersburg and captures an important fort only 6 miles from Richmond, the Confederate capital. It will take Grant 6 more months and cost thousands of additional lives before the Union Army enters Richmond in triumph. One by one, the nails are slowly being driven into the coffin of the Confederacy.
The war out west had gone 3 years. They had walked the trail of tears, and now they suffered sorrow once again. Lack of rations, arms and traps, homeless warriors dressed in rags. Jeb Davis said to fight on for the cause.
August 1864. The fortunes of war, which have turned against the Confederacy in the East, are being felt strongly in the trans-Mississippi West. Since the fall of Vicksburg and the Union's iron fist control of the Mississippi River, supplies from the Confederacy to its Indian allies are few and far between. Worst of all, the civilian population in Indian Territory has suffered greatly. At the start of the war, almost 65,000 people lived in the Indian nations. By war's end, over one-third of the population has been killed or has moved out of the territory. Hannah Hitchcock, wife of Dr. Dwight Hitchcock, kept a diary about the suffering of non-combatants. According to eyewitness accounts like Hitchcock's, both sides, Union and Confederate, took horses and supplies from the starving populace. William P. Ross, the son of Cherokee Chief John Ross, wrote a letter around the end of December 1864 describing conditions in Indian Territory. Everything has been changed by the destroying hand of war, but few men remain in their homes. Nearly all the farms are growing up in bushes and briars, houses abandoned or burnt, some idea of the great and melancholy change which has come over our once prosperous and beautiful country. Livestock of all kinds have become very scarce. Great increase in the number of wild animals. The wolves howl dismally over the land, and the panther's scream is often heard. With the outbreak of war in 1861, all federal posts in Indian Territory, including Fort Washita, Fort Cobb, and Fort Arbuckle, were abandoned by the United States Army. Deactivated in 1857, Fort Gibson had been turned over to the Cherokee Nation. Federal authorities, who under treaty had promised supplies and military protection, now reneged on their promises. And no amount of pleading or official visits on the part of the Indian leaders loyal to the Union was heeded. Units of the Confederate Army swiftly occupied the posts, and the Confederate government sent emissaries, including Albert Pike, to make treaties with the Indian nations in order to ally them with the Confederacy. The Indian nations were torn apart in regard to loyalty between the United States and the Confederate States. As their counterparts in the East found, Indian Territory families were ripped apart by the war as brothers, fathers, and sons go off to fight one another. The Cherokee Nation was one of the 5 civilized tribes that knew such division. When Cherokee Chief John Ross was arrested by Union forces in 1862, some of those troops that arrested him were Cherokee Indians. In 1863, Confederate Brigadier General Samuel B. Maxey is named commander of all Confederate forces in Indian Territory. Originally from Kentucky, Maxey, an able commander, is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. During the Mexican War, he served as a first lieutenant under then-Captain Robert E. Lee. Before the outbreak of hostilities in 1861, Maxey was practicing law and also had held the office of district attorney in Texas. When the war began, Maxey raised his own company of men, holding various command positions until he was appointed brigadier general. In March 1862, he commanded a brigade at the siege of Vicksburg. In August of 1863, Maxey is transferred to the Trans-Mississippi Department and placed in command of Indian Territory. He quickly reorganizes his command and rules that no color line would determine rank. His troops number around 2,000 among the various Indian commands. Also at his disposal is Brigadier General Richard Montgomery Ganot's 5th Texas Cavalry Brigade, which has a roster of 1,800 troops. However, due to the lack of equipment and supplies, full-scale military operations have been reduced to guerrilla warfare. Bushwhacking by both sides is a common practice. General Ganot is a man of many accomplishments. He graduated from Louisville Medical University at Louisville, Kentucky in 1850 before he was 21. He practiced medicine in Kentucky and was physician at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. In 1857, he moved his family to Texas, where he became famous as an Indian fighter and as a state legislator. A deeply religious man, He neither smoked tobacco, drank alcoholic beverages or stimulants, including coffee or tea, and never used foul language. Early in the war, Gounod had organized and led a cavalry command known as Gounod's Texas Cavalry Squadron, made up entirely of volunteers from Texas. With 200 men, he rode to Tennessee to join his good friend, General Albert Sidney Johnston. Unfortunately, Gounod and his men arrived a day after the Battle of Shiloh, in which Johnston was killed. The Texas troops joined the Confederate forces, with Gounod personally reporting to General P.G.T. Beauregard, commander of the Army of the Tennessee. With the help of his old family friend, General John C. Breckinridge, Gounod's cavalry troop was ordered to join Colonel John Hunt Morgan's 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment at Chattanooga, Tennessee. Gounod and his Texans served with distinction as a part of Morgan's raiders. After the disastrous destruction of Morgan's command in 1863, General Gounod was assigned to the Army of the Trans-Mississippi, taking command of the 5th Texas Cavalry Brigade. At the time, he was the youngest Confederate general in the sector. The remnants of his original Texas cavalry troop, now reduced to less than company size and numbers, went with him. The unit is renamed Gounod's Guards in his honor and continued to operate as a part of the 5th Texas. General Maxey has tried to solve the many problems facing his command, including the severe shortage of weapons and supplies. But his efforts have been in vain. From his headquarters at Fort Towson in the Choctaw Nation on February 25, 1864, Maxey writes to his wife about the shortage of weapons.
The great troubles, and the one about which I have the most anxiety than the others, is arms. All for 5,000 good guns, and I would leave northern Texas in safety. I have the promise, but when will it be fulfilled?
Because of Confederate setbacks in the East, Maxey visits the leaders of the Indian nations to beef up support for the struggling Confederacy. On May 14, 1864, he publishes a letter from Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States, intended for all residents of the Indian nations.
The soldiers and the people of the 6 nations in treaty and enmity with us are regarded by this government with the same and tender care and solicitude as are the soldiers and people of all the Confederate States. Our cause is one, and our hearts must be united. We must put forth our whole energy, cultivate harmony and confidence, practice fortitude, bring forth promptly every available man into the field, and resolve to do, and if need be, to die in defense of our birthright. And with the providence of God to guide and to shield us, victory will perch on our banners and bless us with peace, independence, and prosperity. Accept my best wishes for health and happiness to yourselves and to the people of the nations, and believe me, very truly your friend, Jefferson Davis.
A new attack plan drawn up by Stan Watie to drive the Federals from Forts Gibson and Smith has been proposed by Maxey to Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith, the commander of the Trans-Mississippi Department. The plan consists of a strong central raid into Kansas, which it is hoped would cause the withdrawal of federal troops from the various outposts in Indian Territory to protect Kansas. Maxey and his field commanders wait 7 months for a response to the plan from the Confederate Military Command. The exploits of Stan Watie are already legendary. At the start of the war, Watie was commissioned a colonel in the Confederate Army, leading his Cherokee Mounted Volunteers. Now, in 1864, he has risen in rank to brigadier general and will hold the distinction of being the only Indian to hold a general's commission in either army during the war. And his name meant fear and apprehension to his federal enemies stationed along the territory border. His Cherokee name meant to stand firm, immovable, and Watie would stand for the Confederacy until the very end. General Gounod and his Texas troopers are anxious to assume the offensive. While in the field, he writes a letter to Maxey on August 29, 1864.
The hope secures farther reaching because you are going to send me an order to go north of the Arkansas River and do all of the damage to the Yanks I can up there. I have been anxious about it, but there seems so much delaying on our part while the feds are moving trains and regiments to and fro and the finest opportunities afforded to whip them in detail. It is true many of my men are dismounted, barefooted, and unarmed, but they would be better satisfied actively employed than idling in camps. And there would be a pretty fair chance to capture arms, horses, and clothing. I am satisfied we ought to be up there now. The river is fordable, and we are burning away the light of day on the working season. If we were ordered or allowed to go forward, then General Stan Wadey would cooperate with us. But General Cooper is very cautious, and I am satisfied some good opportunities have and are being presented. What say you?
The cautious General Cooper Gano refers to is none other than Major General Douglas H. Cooper, the Superintendent of Indian Affairs in Indian Territory. The same General Cooper who only a year before had led the largest Confederate force ever assembled in Indian Territory into the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Honey Springs near present-day Rentisville, Oklahoma.
Stan Wadey led his Indian warriors out so bold, with brave Texas troopers headed by Gano, and they planned the lightning right up to the north, across the Arkansas against the Union force.
Finally, after months of waiting, Wadey's plan for a raid is approved by the Confederate Military Command. However, the raid must take place before October 1st to coincide with Major General Sterling Price's planned Missouri raid. Just 2 weeks after Gano sent his letter to Maxey, he finds that his Texas troops and Wadey's Indian forces are sharing campfires at Old Camp Pike, which was located on the Canadian River near present-day Whitefield, Oklahoma. Here, ammunition is loaded, equipment is checked, and made ready as they prepare for the raid into Union-held territory. Gano takes 1,200 of his brigade, including the 29th, the 30th, and 31st Texas Cavalry, along with Captain Sylvanus Howell's Texas Artillery Battery with 6 guns. Wadey has 800 soldiers, including the 1st and 2nd Cherokee Regiments, the 1st and 2nd Creek Regiments, and Colonel John Jumpa's Seminoles. Although both men retain command over their individual units, Wadey readily turns command of the expedition over to Gano because his commission predates Wadey's by 1 month. Both Gano and Maxey commend Wadey on his unselfishness, something which up until that time had not been seen by the armies on either side. On September 14, 1864, Gano and Wadey's troops began their ride into history. For 3 days, the Confederate column travels north. Wadey orders Major John Vann to throw out scouts from his 2nd Cherokee Regiment on the right flank as far up the south side of the Arkansas River as possible. Riding with the regiment are Captain Joe Martin and his sons Alexander and Richard. Wadey's oldest son, Saladin, also rides with the column. General Gano also has a relative that's riding on the raid. His brother-in-law, Captain William G. Welch, is in command of Gano's guards. Vann's regiment locates no enemy troops. So far, the southern force appears to be undetected. The column camps at Prairie Springs on the night of September 14th, then crosses the Arkansas River near the Creek Agency. The river is so swollen with recent rains, it becomes necessary to pack over all the artillery ammunition by hand and on horseback. It's difficult work. It takes more than 6 hours to cross the river with the supplies, each man having to cautiously feel for footing as the area is laced with treacherous quicksand. The Confederates then make camp at a site which Wadey calls in his report Camp Pleasant. The southern force is now located only around 11 miles north and west of Fort Gibson. Speed is now imperative for the Confederates because of the greatly enhanced chance of Union scouts detecting such a large force. Even though no modern form of communication existed at that time, word got around remarkably fast due to spies and word of mouth by the civilian population.
At Flat Rock on the Verdigris, they with the Union folk complete. They learned about a wagon train nearby. wagons that Gano did seek the Union's Major Hopkins unprepared.
Union officers realize the vulnerability of their supply lines and are alert for a Confederate strike. Scouts have been sent out all over the countryside to look for any organized Confederate activity. On September 16th, the Confederate force crosses the Verdigris River at the Sandtown Ford, and that afternoon discovers a Union haying party at Flat Rock, 15 miles northwest of Fort Gibson, near present-day Wagner, Oklahoma. Gano and Watie climbed to the top of a high hill, which according to local lore was here at Blue Mound, to spy on the Federal troops. Through field glasses, they see Federal troops cutting hay over a 3-mile area. In command of the 125-man Union detachment is Captain Edgar A. Barker. Barker has been warned by his scouts of the advancing Confederates. However, the first report places the Confederate strength at only 200. Unable to get an idea of the strength of the enemy force, Barker finally rides out to see for himself and runs straight into Gano's advance force. He immediately returns to his troops, positioning his small force of 2nd Kansas Cavalry with a detachment of 1st Kansas colored soldiers in a small ravine. After holding off 3 separate Confederate cavalry charges and seeing his force completely surrounded, Barker makes a command decision to leave the black infantry and mount all cavalry troops who still have their horses. They make a desperate charge at the weakest point in the Confederate line to hopefully break free and warn Fort Gibson. 65 men attempt the breakthrough charge with Barker, but only 15 manage to break through to safety. Lieutenant David M. Sutherland, Company K of the 1st Kansas Colored, is left in command of the remaining men holed up in the ravine. The Confederates begin their final advance. When the smoke clears, over 73 Union casualties litter the field. Out of 37 black troops with the detachment, only 4 are left alive. George Duvall, one of the black soldiers with the detachment, hid in the creek. When the Confederates were camped on the battlefield for the night, Duvall slipped through the Southern pickets carrying his musket with him. Union reports later claimed the indiscriminate killing of black troops by the Confederates, many reportedly killed after they surrendered or were found to be hiding in the tall grass or in the creek. However, these are Union reports and cannot be substantiated. Gano later reported to Major General Cooper that he sent up a truce flag with Major Stackpole along with a captured Federal lieutenant to demand surrender and avoid further killing. But the Northern troops fired on the flag, ignoring his offer. Years later, J.B. Stroud, a Confederate veteran of the battle at Flat Rock, recalled that he saw one man take his own brother prisoner. Howard Holden captured his brother John. He also remembered a son in Confederate gray capturing his own father, who was wearing Federal blue. Through some of the various 85 prisoners taken at the Federal camp, the rebel leaders learned that the expected wagon train was due any day from Fort Scott. The victorious Confederates camp on the battlefield after burning over 3,000 tons of hay, mowing machines, and all haying equipment. Gano writes in his report that the sun witnessed our complete success, and its lingering rays rested upon a field of blood. Early the next morning, Gano sends a small body of men to attack the nearby Hickey Place, another Federal haying camp. After a short skirmish with the strongly guarded camp, the Confederates break off to rejoin their respective commands, already en route north. Now, with all Federal patrols out of the way, the Southern forces can concentrate on their main objective, the wagon train. The wagon train departed Fort Scott on Monday, September 12th, en route to Fort Gibson, with its final destination being Fort Smith, Arkansas. The train consists of a total of 300 wagons, 205 government wagons, 4 government ambulances, and 91 sutler wagons. Wagons are loaded with supplies intended for the military and for the Union refugees at Fort Gibson. The train's escort is under the command of Major Henry Hopkins of the 2nd Kansas Cavalry. Hopkins, a seasoned veteran at the age of 27, is already a hero for capturing an artillery battery at the Battle of Fort Wayne in 1862. He and his battery were also present at the Battle of Honey Springs in 1863. The escort for the train is made up of 80 men of the 2nd Kansas Cavalry, 50 men of the 6th Kansas Cavalry, and 130 men from the 14th Kansas Cavalry. There are also 400 unarmed recruits traveling with the train. At Baxter Springs, Kansas, the train is reinforced by 100 Cherokees led by Captain Talala from the 3rd Indian Home Guard Regiment stationed at Fort Gibson. Major Hopkins had felt it necessary to put all Union Army posts between Fort Scott and Fort Gibson on alert for possible attack by enemy forces. He had also instructed all commanders to send reinforcements to protect the wagon train. When the train reached Hudson's Crossing on the Neosho or Grand River, Hopkins learned of General Sterling Price's movement between Little Rock and Fort Smith. Hopkins immediately sends word to Colonel Stephen H. Wattles at Fort Gibson asking for more reinforcements. Major Hopkins leaves 50 of his men at Hudson's Crossing to act as a rear guard. The train continues down the military road. On Saturday night, September 17th, while the train is camped at Horse Creek, 15 miles north of the Cabin Creek station, a message is received from Fort Gibson that a rebel force of 12 to 1,500 men is now heading north. Colonel Wattles assures Hopkins of reinforcements and relays that he's ordered Major John Foreman, commanding 6 companies with 2 mountain howitzers, to Cabin Creek. Hopkins and the train arrive at the Cabin Creek station at 9 o'clock Sunday morning, September 18th. Waiting to reinforce Hopkins' command at the station is Lieutenant Benjamin Whitlow of the 3rd Indian Regiment with 140 Creeks and Cherokees, along with the garrison force of 170 Union Cherokees of the 2nd Indian Home Guard. Hopkins' forces now total around 1,000, including 610 armed men, white and Indian, as well as the 400 unarmed recruits. Knowing the federal forces at Fort Gibson are without enough horses and mules to effectively pursue his force, Gannot takes his time moving up the Texas Military Road in search of the train, taking 2 days to travel 35 miles, the distance between the hay camp and Cabin Creek. Before leaving the Flat Rock battlefield, he sends a polite note through a released prisoner to Colonel Wattles at Fort Gibson to come and bury the Union dead. When Wattles realized the Southerners had gone up the road after the train, he set about to help relieve the train, even though he'd already sent 400 men to reinforce the escort. Time was of the essence, as the Confederates had a good head start. But how to rush infantry 50 miles up the road in time to help save the train was a difficult question to solve. Luckily for Wattles, the Union commander at Fort Gibson, help was camped nearby. Colonel James M. Williams and his 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, now renamed the 79th U.S. Colored Volunteers, have just arrived from Fort Smith. Williams is the same commander who only a year before had handed Stan Watie his worst defeat in the first battle of Cabin Creek. After a brief discussion, Williams suggests to Wattles that he round up wagons and mule teams in order to rush Williams' black troops and supplies up the Texas Military Road as fast as possible. A few wagons are found and loaded up with ammunition, rations, and men. The rest of the soldiers have to march at the double quick in order to reach Cabin Creek in time to save the train. Gannot's main force camps on Wolf Creek near the present town of Salina, so his scouts can watch for the wagon train on the Texas Road and the road east of the Grand River. Confident that the train has not passed, Gannot takes 400 men and 2 pieces of artillery up the Texas Road to reconnoiter and finds the wagon train parked at the station on Cabin Creek. It is Sunday afternoon, September 18th. Major Hopkins, not realizing the danger the train was in, has not ordered the government wagons parked in any type of defensive or corral formation. Instead, the wagons are haphazardly spread 1.5 miles to the south of the stockade, parking in open order style, each team about 30 feet apart. A group of Sutler wagons are parked on the ridge on the east side of Cabin Creek overlooking the crossing. Over 1,800 mules and horses are leisurely grazing on the prairie in front of the stockade. Hopkins has posted a weak, long-stretched guard around the wagons. Gano immediately sizes up the situation and sends a courier to tell Watie to bring up the rest of the Confederate column. Until the rest of the main force arrives, Gano and his men make camp in this small hollow only a few miles south of the Cabin Creek stockade. It is a deep hollow sheltered on the north side by a huge rock formation. Late that afternoon, Hopkins takes 25 men to scout for Confederate forces. He had received reports from his scouts that a rebel force of 100 men had been encountered. He finds the Southern men posted in a hollow only 3 miles south of the station, but Hopkins cannot get close enough to ascertain their approximate size or strength. Although Hopkins later reported that he doubled his pickets and moved the train in a quarter circle near the rear of the stockade, he had no idea as to the size or the strength of the enemy force getting ready to confront him head-on. While waiting in the darkness at Wolf Creek, the highly superstitious Indian troops see a white deer, which they immediately take as a sign that foretells of their coming victory over their Union enemies. Watie and the remainder of the Southern force joins Gano around midnight.
Early morning by moonlight, September 19th, there the fight began between the blue and the ragged gray. Watie and Gano attacked, they beat the Union pickets back. Confusion reigned in Major Hopkins' camp.
At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on Monday, September 19th, 1864, the Confederates form a line of battle and move to within 500 yards of the Federal stockade. In the bright moonlight, they can see the stockade with what appears to be immense earthworks positioned to the front. The Confederates form a double line with cavalry at the front and infantry immediately behind. Captain Patrick Cosgrove, in command of the Union advance picket post of 22 men, is there to meet the intruders. A warning shot rings out from the Union picket line at the dark shapes coming toward them. In the darkness, Cosgrove approaches the battle line directly in front of his position. Cosgrove, the sheriff of Olathe, Kansas, before the war, was used to dealing with the unexpected. He'd fought with pro-slavery forces before the war in bloody Kansas, but tried to be impartial to both sides during his tenure as sheriff and Deputy United States Marshal. From several different eyewitnesses, apparently the Confederate line advanced to within several yards of Cosgrove's position. It is believed that General Gano himself talked with Captain Cosgrove.
What are your men?
Federals! And you?
Rebels, by God!
May God damn you, sir! I invite you to come forward.
Who is your commander?
A Fed, who's yours?
A mixture. Will you protect a flag of truce?
I'll tell you in 5 minutes.
Gano's aide hands Cosgrove a written order demanding the surrender of the Union garrison. Cosgrove proceeds to find his commander, Major Hopkins, for an answer. 15 minutes go by, and still no word from the Federals. Suddenly, the Confederates hear the sounds of several wagons moving toward the stockade. Gano assumes the movement of wagons is a negative response and orders his line forward. Later, Union officers will claim they were not given enough time to answer the surrender demand, but this may have been an obvious slant to mask the truth and protect the military reputation of Major Hopkins for allowing his command to be surprised and flanked by the enemy. The rebels advance, and Federal musketry greets them. The Confederates immediately answer with a thunderous cannonading of the stockade. That's something Major Hopkins is totally unprepared for. Well, the sound of the cannon panics the mule team, still hitched to the wagons. And in the blackness, the mules drag some of the wagons off of these 100-foot bluffs into the creek below. The Confederates close to within 300 yards of the Federal position as Howell's 6-gun battery continues firing solid shot and exploding shell, creating sheer pandemonium in the Union camp. One eyewitness wrote, "Soldiers, teamsters, mules, and wagons, in a perfect cyclone of excitement, went flying back toward the timber. Some men mounted the unhitched mules where they could catch them, only to be thrown off again by the frantic animals. Some ran on foot among the wildly rushing torrent of men, wagons, and animals, teams and parts of teams, dragging their wagons without guidance, crashed into each other as they turned from the rebel fire in their front and raced madly for timber in the rear. Without waiting for orders, the teamsters, civilians, and soldiers alike hastily grabbed horses and saddle mules to retreat back up the Texas Road in the direction of Fort Scott. Colonel Charles DeMorse of the 29th Texas Cavalry regularly sent dispatches to his hometown newspaper in Clarksville, Texas. They vividly described the battle to the folks back home as he saw it that night. The bright flashes of musketry along both lines, the white smoke of the bursting bombs, the whistle of the Minnie-Ball, accompanied by the guttural sounds of Howell's artillery as it belched forth its iron messengers of death under the brilliant luster of the moon and stars, rendered the scene sublime. Dr. George A. Moore, a dentist from Leavenworth, Kansas, was in the Cabin Creek stockade that fateful night. He had joined the wagon train at Baxter Springs, Kansas, and was bound for Fort Smith, where his professional services as a dentist had been requested. Years later, he recounted the events of that night. Officers and soldiers were running toward the prairie, and I followed soon, coming to a double line of battle formed upon the open prairie. In the dim distance, I could see the dark outline of the Confederates and hear their shouts. But the distance was too great for words to be distinguished. Our soldiers, mistaking the sounds of hoofs of a runaway band of mules for those of a charging body of Confederate cavalry, discharged a volley of musketry, and the scene of confusion that followed is indescribable. The teams of mules, stampeded and entirely beyond control, were running in various directions, and I was in the midst of the tumult. The wild grass was so high that I could not see the teams until they were almost upon me, and no sooner did I spring from before one team than I would find myself directly in front of another. It seemed almost miraculous that I escaped injury. The maelstrom of fire continues, and the Confederates later tell stories around their campfires about the unearthly sounds of the crashing wagons and the mixed high-pitched screams of mules and men. On the Federal right, Wade's men find a weak point and drive the Federals from their rifle pit positions, thus leaving a large segment of the train in Confederate hands. At this point in the battle, one question still remains. During the Confederate onslaught, where was Major Henry Hopkins? In his official report, Hopkins stated he tried to rally the Teamsters in order to get the rest of the wagons under control. However, several eyewitnesses later stated he was nowhere to be found after the shooting started. Dr. Moore went on record writing that Major Hopkins placed me in command of a small company of Indian soldiers and informed me that he would immediately make an attempt to meet and hasten the coming reinforcements, said to be but a few miles distant. According to Moore's account, Hopkins left before daylight toward the Grand River. This means his official report must be considered wrong, as he was not on the battlefield and certainly could not have been at the stockade to order a retreat after sunup once the Confederates began their final advance. Another eyewitness, Captain Nathaniel B. Lucas of the 6th Kansas Cavalry, commanded a company under Hopkins. He told a newspaper reporter, "I heard officers asking anxiously, 'Where's Major Hopkins? Who's in command?' Hopkins was nowhere to be found. He had abandoned the outfit and struck out for the Grand River on his way to Fort Gibson. With the victorious rebels coming on, yelling and firing, stampeding teams, and single horses and mules running back toward the creek, hell seemed turned loose right there and then. And with no commanding officer, what could the soldiers be expected to do but break to the rear and try to save themselves the best they could? Oh, it was shameful." Captain Cosgrove later reported to his commanding officer that he did not know where Major Hopkins was at the time the attack came, but thought he was cut off from his command. With the moon now down, Gano and Wadey have no real idea of what is happening and decide to wait until daybreak to continue the attack. The shooting slowly stops. During the rest of the night, when the Union force tries to move the remaining wagons, the Confederates fire a few volleys and then retire. Some of the Confederate Cherokees challenge and taunt their Union brothers inside the stockade with their ancient turkey gobble call. The Union Cherokees respond with the same turkey gobble challenge. Many of the Southerners later told that the Union men were apparently drinking, and many were drunk when the attack on the stockade began. One Confederate wrote that there were buckets of whiskey on the battlefield after the battle. General Watie told the troops not to drink the liquor from the buckets because it might be poisoned. Drunkenness on the battlefield was substantiated by the report that Lieutenant Samuel L. Jennings of the 14th Kansas Cavalry was captured by the Confederates and reported by his fellow officers as being in a state of beastly intoxication when last seen on the field.
As the musketry and cannon fire did roar, frantic mules and wagons wildly running o'er, o'er the eastern ridge the sun began to shine, as the rebel yells echoed along the line.
Daybreak reveals what Gounod and Watie have been waiting for, the exact position of the train and its defenders. In the early morning light, they can also see what they thought were earthworks are in reality only huge hayricks. The hayricks are positioned running parallel with the creek to the old home of Greenbrier Joe Martin on the Texas Road. The Union troops have reinforced the stockade fence surrounding the Martin house as well, giving them added protection from small arms fire. Captain George W. Grayson, who would later serve as the chief of the Creek Nation, was in command of a company in the 1st Creek Regiment at the Cabin Creek Battle. He wrote in his memoirs that some of the Indian soldiers were relying on a magic medicine bag to protect them. First Lieutenant Fixico, or Thomas Benton, as he was called in English, offered the medicine bag to Grayson. The educated Grayson loudly scorned his Creek's superstition and admonished them to dismiss the medicine pouch. He then walked boldly up and down the Creek lines under fire to demonstrate that magic medicine had no effect on Yankee bullets and was ridiculous. Gounod rearranges his artillery, moving one section of Howell's battery to the Federal right flank. Now, the Southern cannons are within 100 yards of the Union fortification. The Confederates continue the unrelentless bombardment of the stockade with shot and shell. This move pins down the Federal troops in a murderous artillery crossfire, pounding their resistance in the ground. Seizing the advantage, Watie sends Colonel C.N. Vann with 2 Cherokee regiments across the creek to capture retreating wagons and to prevent further escape by fleeing Union soldiers. Vann returns without any wagons, but has captured 18 prisoners. Meanwhile, Gounod plans to overrun the Union position with a cavalry charge, a move which would demoralize the Union side. He personally leads Gurley's 30th Texas in an attack on the Federal left, but a detachment of men from the Union 6th Kansas Cavalry are positioned in this gully, and they wait until the Confederates are only 25 yards away before opening fire. Surprised, the rebels fall back, sustaining the heaviest Confederate casualties of the day, with 3 killed, 16 wounded. The 6-gun Confederate artillery belches round after round of canister at the Union position. The effect of the canister and grape shot was devastating. It can be described as being like a huge shotgun blast, as lead and iron balls, some up to 1.5 inches in diameter, are hurled toward an enemy with a range of 200 to 400 yards. It was under this type of fire that Captain Henry Ledger of the 6th Kansas Cavalry then led one of the most daring feats of the day. With 12 Federal cavalrymen, he charges one Southern battery as a last resort to silence the cannon. Ledger's charge fails as he falls only 15 feet from the mouth of one of the cannons. His horse riddled with balls. Thought to be dead, Captain Ledger later surprised everyone at the 15th Kansas Cavalry headquarters at Osage Mission, Kansas, when he and some of his men show up alive and well. Gounod decides to press his advantage in one final charge. He orders Lieutenant Colonel Otis G. Welch, commanding the 29th Texas, Captain Strayhorn and the 30th Texas, along with Major Morant and Martin's regiment, to the opposite end of the Confederate line to sweep around and flank the Federal right. Meanwhile, Colonel John Jumper's Creek and Seminole troops, having fallen back to replenish their ammunition, returned to the front line and began firing volley after volley at the Union defenders. This combination attack of men and artillery proves too much for the Federals, who suddenly give way. The rebel yell reverberates again and again as the Confederate line begins its final advance. Now, with no hope of holding out for reinforcements to arrive, the remaining Union troops make good their escape along the Brushy Creek bottom. The Southerners pursue the retreating Federals for several miles, capturing some and killing those who put up a fight. A remarkable account of the battle by a teamster with the wagon train has survived. Union Private Alfred Collins told the story to his brother-in-law, R.M. Peck, who published the account years later. Here, for the first time since 1904, is Collins' own story.
When the shooting started, the cannon shells and musket balls were flying pretty thick through the trees. I concluded I had better get behind a tree that stood alongside my wagon and wait till the shower of shot slackened up. By and by, the enemy's firing slackened, and I looked around and everybody was gone. I was alone. I started off afoot when a soldier's horse, bridled and saddled but without a rider, came galloping past me. I lunged out and grabbed the bridle and hung on to him and quickly climbed into the saddle. The horse had been shot in 2 or 3 places, and the saddle was bloody, indicating the former rider had been shot and had fallen off. I tried to turn the horse north back towards Fort Scott, but instead the horse made a mad run at the rebel line. Unable to turn the horse around, I decided to take a gamble and bluff my way through the Confederate lines. The only problem was I was wearing a blue Federal overcoat, which might give me away. However, the moon had gone down, so I thought I might not be discovered.
The bold ruse worked as the horse slowed down and trotted through the Southern men, who mistook the Union teamster for one of their own.
I heard one of them say, "There goes the general's aide, going to bring up the artillery, I reckon." This gave me a cue to act like the general's aide if I were confronted by anyone. As I rode through the rebel lines, I noticed that many of the mounted Southern men were wearing blue overcoats just like the one I had on. This gave me confidence that I would not be detected. Just as I managed to get to the gap between the mounted men and the infantry, an officer approached on horseback to find out who I was and where I was going. Thinking fast, I called out to the officer, "Where's that battery? The general wants it moved up to the front," I yelled as I continued towards the Confederate rear. On nearing the 2 guns of a battery, I noticed another mounted officer and yelled to him, "Captain, the general wants you to move your guns up nearer to the front where he is, in the direction of those haystacks over there." I immediately proceeded to use my horse to indicate the direction to place the guns. As I reached the edge of the timber, I distinctly heard the captain give the order to limber up. Riding on, I encountered a few rebel stragglers who I told to hurry up because we had the Yankees on the run.
Collins then rode on to Fort Gibson without any further mishap. He was one of the few Union soldiers who kept his head under fire and lived to tell about it.
By 9 o'clock that smoky morn, the field with bodies strewn and torn, the fearful struggle had come to an end. Wade's greatest raid was o'er, 130 wagons more were captured by the joyous Weary Reds.
By 9 o'clock on the morning of September 19th, 1864, the Second Battle of Cabin Creek is over. This time, the Confederates are victorious. They have complete control of the field. General Wadey gallops into the stockade shouting, "Hurrah for General Gano," and is quickly joined in the cheer by both Texans and Indians. In their haste to escape, the Union force has left their dead and wounded on the field. Casualties are few considering the number of troops involved in the engagement. Union losses are reported at 54 killed, missing, or wounded, while the Confederate leaders report 45 killed, wounded, or missing. Burial details are assembled to bury the Confederate dead, and the wounded are tended to as the Southern troops gather the serviceable wagons for the return trip south. 130 wagons and 740 mules survive the battle and are swung into line. The goods and provisions in the captured train are estimated to be worth over $1,500,000. The spoils include clothing, which the Confederates gleefully exchange for their rags, Although Union blue, the clothes will quickly fade in the sun. Anything not salvageable is burned or destroyed, including the remaining provisions that the Southern forces cannot haul away. Adding to the embarrassment of Major Hopkins, he has to write later in his official report that he lost all of his correspondence, returns for government property, commissions, and all muster rolls. The Union stockade is put to the torch, along with 3,000 tons of hay and all equipment. However, upon the humanitarian request of Dr. A.S. Ritchie, the Union surgeon, the hospital and its stores are spared by the Confederates. Among the prisoners are 40 women who are on their way to visit friends and relatives serving in the Federal Army. General Gannot assigns a couple of guards to protect them. He generously offered to send all of the women north, but they would not go. So they're loaded up in the wagons with the rest of the captured supplies. After 2 hours, the wagon train is put into column and begins its slow trek south. The wagon train travels for only 1 hour before scouts make contact with the relief troops of the 79th U.S. Colored Regiment. At George May's farm near Pryor's Creek, Gannot forms his line for battle, but keeps the Union troops at a distance with skirmish fire. At 4:30 in the afternoon, an artillery duel begins between the two forces and lasts until dark. Colonel Williams decides against a direct frontal assault because his men are exhausted after a 50-mile forced march. It will prove to be a costly decision. As night cloaks the battleground, General Gannot orders his soldiers to build campfires. But this is just one part of a bold ruse. One of the wagons is emptied and driven over rocky ground near the creek. This gives the impression to Union pickets that the wagon train is being parked for the night. For 2 hours, the empty wagon is driven back and forth as the actual wagon train slips away to the northwest. The Federals awake to find the train is gone, but due to their weakened condition, cannot pursue. Williams pulls his force back to the hay camp at Flat Rock. Meanwhile, Major John Foreman and his relief force are the first to arrive on the scene at Cabin Creek. He finds quartermaster stores from the wagons strewn along the Texas road for miles. The Union dead have been left on the battlefield. Determined, the Confederate raiders do not sleep for the next 3 days and nights as they race for the Arkansas River and safety. Gannot later wrote in his report about these 3 days.
Our boys were without sleep, except as such as they could snatch in the saddle or at watering places. They dug down banks, cut out trees, rolled wagons and artillery up hills and banks by hand, kept cheerful and never wearied in the good cause, and came into camp rejoicing.
The Southern column crosses the Verdigris River at Claremore Mound near Captain Clem Rogers' place. Rogers, a scout for Watie, will be the father of world-renowned humorist Will Rogers. Watie, worried about the performance of his men, orders whiskey barrels captured in the raid emptied into the Verdigris River. He wants nothing to mar their victory. The column continued on to Tulseytown, where the wagon train crossed the Arkansas River at a place still known today as Gannot's Crossing. This is Gannot's Crossing as it appears today, just north of the 11th Street Bridge on the Arkansas River in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In his letters, Richard Martin wrote about his Civil War experiences. Rod Martin, Richard's great-grandson, reads from his writings about the Second Battle of Cabin Creek.
The slaves went into the fields and hoed corn or picked cotton to the tune of Dixie. And the next thing we knew, the southern states had fallen out of the Union, heels over head, and then the devil was to pay. And for the next 4 years in this country, a man's life depended upon his fleetness or his alertness in hiding and dodging. It was neighbor against neighbor, and in some instance, brother against brother. Old men and boys were murdered, women and children turned out of doors, their homes plundered and burned. My 17th birthday found me serving in Company D, 2nd Cherokee Regiment of the Mounted Volunteers, Confederate Army. Colonel William Penn Adair, Brigadier General Stan Watie, Major General D.H. Cooper were with us at that time on Brazil Creek in the Choctaw Nation. Our command saw but little service after I joined it except picket duty. However, on September 1864, we made a raid into the enemy country and captured a U.S. supply train of 300 wagons and teams loaded with Army supplies. I don't suppose we would have undertaken this enterprise had it not been for the fact that we were destitute of clothing and winter was coming on. Well do I remember the condition of my uniform on that occasion. My shirt was without a back, but the defect was covered by a friendly gray jacket with buttons of wood. My pants from the pockets down was only represented by the inner part called lining. My shoes were almost soleless, with a good slice of the uppers gone. My hat, well, I'm not positive whether I had one or not. And my garb was about as respectable as many others in our command. The 1st of October found us safe on our side of the deadline, the Arkansas River, where a division of the goods took place. And then, had Uncle Sam come upon us, he would have claimed us for his soldiers, as every one of the 2,200 men and officers was arrayed in bright blue uniforms with bright shining buttons. The spring of 1865 found us in the southern part of the Choctaw Nation along the Blue and Red Rivers. It was following this battle of Big Cabin Creek that the northern troops had burned Pensacola Place to the ground. Now, as the lush green grass rippled in the breeze, it was difficult to believe that somewhere beneath it, soldiers of the North and South lay buried in a common grave, and that the field had once run red with blood. Now everything seemed tranquil and perfect.
The news of the captured wagon train traveled quickly. Headlines, along with official dispatches, appeared in the September 27, 1864 edition of the New York Times. From Fort Scott, government train captured and burned at Cabin Creek. Stan Watie in strong force moving north. Loss, 2 million. The article went on to point out that the Confederate force of 1,500 was not commanded by Watie. However, they did not know who was in command. The story also reported to the northern readers that few men were killed or hurt. In a follow-up story the next day, the New York Times reported that none of the forces guarding the train were killed or taken prisoner, and few were wounded. After the train was safely in Confederate territory, the spoils were divided among the hungry army. Watie refused to take any of the supplies, but his men realized the need of his family, loaded a wagon with food and clothing, and sent it to Mrs. Watie. General Gannot made a present of 2 bolts of calico from the captured wagon train to the wife of Major General Edmund Kirby Smith. He also presented General Maxey with cans of pineapple and oysters taken from one of the wagons in the Cabin Creek raid. The captured train gave a much-needed boost to the low morale of the Trans-Mississippi Department. On January 19, 1865, a joint resolution of both houses of the Confederate Congress commends Gannot and Watie on their daring and skill in the capture of the wagon train on the 19th of September, 1864. Trans-Mississippi Department Commander Edmund Kirby Smith publishes his own congratulatory order from his headquarters in Shreveport, Louisiana.
General Orders, number S1, October 12, 1864. The General Commanding announces to the Army the complete success of one of the most brilliant raids of the war. The expedition under Brigadier Generals Gannot and Stan Watie, penetrating far within the enemy's lines, has captured his forage camp and train, destroyed 5,000 tons of hay, and brought out 130 captured wagons loaded with stores after destroying as many more which were disabled in the action. These, with 135 prisoners and more than 200 of the enemy killed and wounded, attest the success of the expedition. The celebrity of the movement, the dash of the attack, and their entire success entitle the commands engaged to the thanks of the country.
Though the South did rise to fall, a few of us still do recall that daring victory at Cabin Creek. In that war, so many died for Union and for Southern pride. We honor them today, lest we forget.
Well, just as the capture of the wagon train boosted Southern morale, it also put fear into the hearts of the people of Kansas and Missouri. Now just about everybody was seeing a rebel behind some bush or some tree, depending on who you talk to. The governor of Kansas even called out the state militia to meet that anticipated Confederate attack. Why, Stan Watie was reported to be attacking several places all at the same time. But the Second Battle of Cabin Creek was the last major military operation of the Civil War in Indian Territory, and perhaps there's some justice in the fact that the final battle in the territory was a Confederate victory, even though the rebel forces were plagued by shortages, disappointments, and defeats all throughout the war. The Union juggernaut continued onward, and the war ended in the East 7 months later. But even as Lee's army was laying down its weapons and furling its banners for the last time, the Confederate forces in Indian Territory were planning yet another raid. What stopped them was the same problem they had experienced all too often during the war, the shortage of supplies and equipment. However, the successful guerrilla operations would allow them to hold out for another 2 months after Appomattox. On June 25, 1865, in the town of Dokesville, Choctaw Nation, Stan Watie and his command formally and officially ceased hostilities. With the stroke of a pen, Watie signed this document, making him the last Confederate general to surrender. Lieutenant Colonel Asa Matthews of the 99th Illinois Volunteer Infantry received and accepted the surrender on behalf of the Union forces. This is a view of Dokesville's main street as it appears today. The one-time capital of the Choctaw Nation is now overgrown and its buildings have disappeared. However, in the center of Main Street lies this marker, erected by the Oklahoma Historical Society, marking the site of Stan Watie's surrender. Only a few years after the war, the sutlers and the owners of the goods and the wagons he had helped purloin at Cabin Creek tried to sue him for the loss. However, the rough years of campaigning took their toll on Watie's health, and he died in 1871. He's buried here at the Polson Cemetery near the Oklahoma-Arkansas state line. Monuments to Stan Watie stand just outside the cemetery and next to his grave. There are also monuments to Watie and the Confederate soldiers of Indian Territory. Two stand on the old Cherokee Nation Capitol grounds in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and the other one stands in front of the Bryant County Courthouse in Durant, Oklahoma. Stan Watie and his men are not forgotten. Near the end of the war, Brigadier General Richard Montgomery Gannot was reassigned to Richmond, Virginia. After Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Gannot was approached by several ex-Confederate leaders wanting to continue the Confederate cause in Mexico. Gannot declined. Years later, he was told by Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee that he had been commissioned a major general in the Confederate Army, and they both had signed the commission papers. Unfortunately, the commission never reached him. Although requested by Davis and Lee to accept the honor, Gannot never accepted the title. The man who was wounded only once in 78 engagements of the Civil War faithfully served as an ordained minister of the Christian Church for 45 years. He and his family prospered in the Dallas area. He and his brother John Allen Gannot engaged in the business of importing and selling shorthorn cattle and blood-trotting horses from Kentucky. Gannot started a family tradition which was later carried on by his great-grandson, billionaire Howard Hughes. Gannot was also instrumental in the formation of the United Confederate Veterans Organization in Texas and was the featured speaker at several Confederate reunions. He died in March 1913 at the age of 83, the last surviving Confederate general of his rank. General Gannot is buried here in the Oakland Cemetery in Dallas, Texas, surrounded by his wife and children. Henry Hopkins had to live with the humiliating defeat at Cabin Creek the rest of his life. Almost 1 month to the day after the capture of the wagon trains at Cabin Creek, Hopkins resigned his commission, citing his service since the beginning of the war in 1861 and his request to be mustered out with his command. Hopkins was officially mustered out in January 1865. He later served as the warden of the Kansas State Penitentiary for 13 years. He was also appointed a commissioner for the Kansas Railroad Commission. Major Hopkins died December 18, 1883, at the age of 46. His obituary in the Leavenworth paper listed his gallant service in the war, but left out the defeat at Cabin Creek. It seems that Kansas and his troops had finally forgiven him. Greenbrier Joe Martin returned to his ranch in 1866, but life at Cabin Creek would never be the same.
After the war was over for the next spring, Richard Martin and his father, Joe Martin, and so far as I know, Alex Martin was with them, they went back to the old Martin plantation, and everything was destroyed and gone, but Richard said they pitched a tent and were trying to live in this tent, and the federal troops came by and destroyed their tent and told them they could not have a tent, that they were rebels. And anytime they would try to put up any kind of a shelter, and the federal troops would find it for the next 2 years, they would come and tear their shelter up. And he said they actually lived off of the land for 2 years.
In his golden years, Greenbrier Joe Martin wrote for the Veneta Chieftain and other newspapers under the pen name of Greenbrier Joe. He, like many other Southern men, had seen his home and his prosperity and his way of life vanish, never to return. Greenbrier Joe Martin died of pneumonia in November 1891. Many throughout the Cherokee Nation grieved at his passing. Some of his family and friends said that Uncle Joe died of a broken heart. His obituary in the Cherokee News, printed in Salina, perhaps gave the best summary of his life. He was one of the few connecting links uniting the present with the past history of our country. Only one or two others could claim intimate acquaintance with the historic past. Perhaps no other living or dead Cherokee had such a faculty of entertaining with anecdote and word pictures of long ago. Greenbrier Joe Martin was laid to rest at the burial site he had selected, only about 25 yards from the Grand River, which he loved. His grave was moved to the old Ross Mays Cemetery near Salina when Lake Hudson was under construction. Richard Martin inherited his father's Rock Creek plantation and built this house on the plantation in 1880. Martin is the gentleman sitting on the porch petting the family dog. And this is the house as it still stands today, just outside Pensacola. In 1907, Martin tried to file a claim against the government for the destruction of the Martin Ranch at Cabin Creek. This letter cut that claim short when Martin was told he had to prove he was loyal to the Union during the war. Colonel James Williams, the man who had defeated Stan Wadey in the first battle of Cabin Creek and then couldn't catch him after the second battle, was breveted Brigadier General of Volunteers. After the war, he remained in the regular army and was renowned as an Indian fighter and for daring exploits. 2 arrows cut his army career short, and in 1873 he retired from the army and moved to Washington, D.C. After the war, Major General Samuel Maxey returned to Texas to practice law before moving to Washington to practice law in front of the United States Supreme Court. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1874 and served as a senator from the state of Texas for 14 years. Maxey died August 16, 1895 in Eureka Springs, Arkansas at the age of 70. He is buried in Paris, Texas. Over the years, the Cabin Creek battle has been steeped in folklore. On April 2, 1882, a 36-year-old farmer named Richard M. Roark hobbled into the Polk County, Missouri clerk's office and applied for a government pension. He had served in the 14th Kansas Cavalry during the war. His pension papers read in part, "While in service, received a gunshot wound in the knee while escorting a supply train from Fort Scott, Kansas at Cabin Creek, Cherokee Nation, which incapacitated me. unable to perform manual labor, because of which I pray for a pension. When he received his wound, Roark was 18 years old and had been in the Army a little more than 1 month. He was awarded his pension for military service at the rate of $18 a month. Aaron Seymour was the second sergeant in Company D, 30th Texas Cavalry, CSA. Sergeant Seymour fought in the Second Battle of Cabin Creek, which was the 6th major battle he had participated in 9 months. The tintype of the sergeant shows him wearing a simple homemade shirt and holding a militia-style sword and scabbard. At the close of the war, he returned to Texas, married, farmed, and raised livestock, as well as 10 children. In 1929, Thomas Hendricks, a 90-year-old Union veteran of the battle, spoke of his experiences at Cabin Creek in an article published by the Tulsa World. Hendricks recalled that one of the hottest places he was ever in was at the campground at Cabin Creek, Cherokee Nation, on September 19, 1864.
And that southern pride shone bright at Cabin Creek. Rebel victory that morning was complete. Forgotten warriors who once rode hard through the night. But we know they fought for what they thought was right.
And a legend lives on today at Cabin Creek that in these parts rivals the stories of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. Now, the story has to do with a cannon that was supposedly knocked from its emplacement on the Cabin Creek bluffs. This was during the Second Battle. Just a story, you say? Well, over the years, many people claim they saw that cannon and even touched it. Mrs. Delmar Martin is one of those eyewitnesses.
Well, Daddy Martin was going to take our Bill and my two little sons to swim one summer. And he said, well, I'll go with you. So we went and walked along the creek. And all at once I looked over, and here was this cannon down in the water. And I said, well, Daddy Martin, that's a cannon in there. Look, at the whole carriage was out, the main part and one wheel, all showing. And he said, oh, that's just an old Civil War cannon. And he said, see those gouge marks in the bank there? Said there was a cannon in every one. But I never could get him to get them out. I just begged for ages to go back and get the thing out of the creek. And I guess it's under the lake now, isn't it?
Today the guns are silent at Cabin Creek. Instead of the sounds of cannon and musketry, one hears only the birds and, of course, the wind. Those who died and were buried here are long forgotten. The Confederate graves have been lost, unmarked, and even if they were clearly marked, the Federal forces occupying the area after the battle may have destroyed those markers. Such is the reality of war. 16 Union soldiers who died at Cabin Creek and 12 Union dead from Flat Rock were moved to the Fort Gibson National Cemetery in 1867. They now lie side by side at rest in the soil that they fought to defend, identified only by grave numbers which mark their final resting place. Our country honors them still by flying the Star-Spangled Banner that they fought and died for at half-mast. As President Abraham Lincoln said at Gettysburg, they here gave the last full measure of devotion. For the rest of the Union and Confederate dead still buried at Cabin Creek, there is this monument to remember the Confederate victory, and there are these smaller monuments designed to give the visitor an idea of which direction the Southern attack came from, as well as the Union defense positions. And maybe they also serve to remind us of a different time when Indian, black and white, slaves, freemen, neighbors and brothers, Americans all, went to war against each other.
East Atlanta fell, Petersburg a living hell. Out west the rebels left to fight alone. The war out west had gone 3 years. They had walked a trail of tears, and now they suffered sorrow once again. Lack of rations, arms and traps, homeless warriors dressed in rags. Jeff Davis said to fight on for the cause. Stan Wadey led his Indian warriors out so bold, with brave Texas troopers headed by Gano. And they planned the lightning right up to the north, across the Arkansas against the Union force. At Flat Rock on the Verdigris, they with the Union foe complete. They learned about a wagon train nearby. By a place called Cabin Creek, the wagons that Gano did seek, the Union's Major Hopkins unprepared. Early morning by moonlight, September 19th, there the fight began between the blue and the ragged gray. Wadey and Gano attacked, they beat the Union pickets back. Confusion reigned in Major Hopkins' camp, as the musketry and cannon fire did roar. Frantic mules and wagons wildly running o'er the eastern ridge, the sun began to shine, as the rebel yells echoed along the line. By 9 o'clock that smoky morn, the field with bodies strewn and torn, the fearful struggle had come to an end. Wadey's greatest raid was o'er, 130 wagons more were captured by the joyous Quiver Reds. Though the South did rise to fall, a few of us still do recall that daring victory at Cabin Creek. In that war so many died for Union and for Southern pride. We honor them today lest we forget. And that Southern pride shone bright at Cabin Creek. Rebel victory that morning was complete. Forgotten warriors who once rode hard through the night, but we know they fought for what they thought was right. Forgotten warriors who once rode hard through the night, but we know they fought